So when you like, Yoga, you can start your presentation.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here.
Okay, I'll go ahead. Yeah, so thank you so much for having me and for inviting me to this conference. I've actually never really spoke at a conference about this topic, so I hope everyone finds it enjoyable. This is my first experience about UX and urban. And it's also my first experience using Zoom, so hopefully it's going to work well.
It's just a green button there that says share
Yeah.
screen in the bottom line of the thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Got it.
Here we are. I will close my mic.
All right.
The floor is yours. Okay.
So thanks. And so, I mean, as you probably know, I'm a UX designer at Google, but I'm actually working at Google Search, which is not directly impacting urban urban design. But in my previous life, I actually was in the PhD course on media design, and my research was actually about how humans, technology, and urban space kind of interacts with each other. I've also worked with interactive installations for public spaces. And besides that, before I was an environmental engineer, and so I did study a bit of urban planning. So my life has been actually coming from the real, analog world, and eventually I kind of transitioned to the digital world where it is what I am now. And so I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about some trends that I've been seeing. I think cities are one of the most complex systems in this world. And so I also think that in a way, these are also the ultimate platforms where kind of digital tech can operate and improve and create value. And I kind of see like the places where technology can improve and operate as three main spaces. One is the digital. So this would be like web and apps. And this space is actually very controlled. When we create it, we can guide the user however we want. And that's basically like just one user and one UI. So we can kind of take control of everything. But then this other space, which is our home, and where digital is kind of leaking into, it's not fully controlled by us. Some things we can control, but most of the things like people around and lights, sounds, we cannot really control. So it's a bit trickier to design for the home. And conversely, for the city, which, as I said, I feel like it's one of the most complex environments that exist in our world. It's just full of people and a lot of UIs, either digital or analog, a lot of different interactions every day, every hour, every minute. And so, but we also can feel in our digital trends that kind of digital is going away from the screen and going into the city, right? And so as an intermediate step, it's kind of going into home first. And as an example, for example, Google or Alphabet, we're kind of in the app or web age, and then Google and the Nest and kind of assistant line of products are going into home, and now we can talk with Google now. But then there's projects from, like, for example, Sidewalk Labs. They are going into the city and kind of being around people rather than people being around the device. Right? In the same way, Amazon has they sell like physical stuff and products, but then they also feel the value of being local, And so they create Alexa, and even more so, they started like brick and mortar stores, and for example, Amazon Go, it's one of these examples. Yeah, and then Facebook, which it's a bit different because they operate in the social aspect. So they cannot, or it's not maybe their interest to be in the city itself, but it's on their interest to kind of facilitate communication. And then they have VR and Portal in the home. And maybe in the future, some rumors say maybe there's going to be a WhatsApp super app, which might interact with the city a little bit more. And I kind of feel like, you know, we've been a long way into digital for, I don't know, 20 years, maybe more. And now we've actually been in this very stable environment for digital. Experimentation has been done, you know, 50 years ago, slowly into our lives, and now we're kind of comfortable with digital web. But in this kind of leaking from our screens into the home, experimentation has been done. Now we have like products in our home. It's going a bit faster, I believe, than what happened 30, 40 years ago. And in the city, I think at the same time, we're kind of already experimenting with not just sidewalk labs, but there's like smart city projects going on everywhere in the world. So it's still very much in the experimentation phase, but I do believe it's going to come much quicker than the internet. And if we think about what can tech bring to the city, I think it can bring a few interesting or different perspectives and kind of expertise, right? And of course, the obvious one is automation and infrastructure. I'm not going to focus too much on this one. So I would say like the backend infrastructure, the goal is smart cities, right? To have a smart city. But actually my interest to focus now is actually in the front end. And I think tech can also bring some really good ideas for the human facing side, you know, UX side. So yeah, so if we focus on this, I kind of feel like conceptually the world and the web are not too different. I mean, if we think about it, when we created the web, all the metaphors and like how the web works is basically a city, right? I mean, we have like spaces which are pages, and like people are moving between these pages and they're interacting with these pages, which are which would be nodes in the city. And so we kind of use the same concept. I mean, we even call it cyberspace. So it's like real space, but you know, in a computer. And so conversely, I think if we think about the augmented world that we're going to have in the future with more technology, we can also use all the learnings and all the knowledge that we've gotten throughout these years from digital web and apply it to this augmented world. Again, augmented world would not be a completely different world, I believe. I mean, it's the analog and digital will probably be more fused or like working closer together. So I think we can take the knowledge from our current city and disciplines and our UX disciplines and mash it together and find good points on both and how to create these augmented worlds with really good practices. And so as digital and analog becomes more blurry, I believe something else is happening, which is the speed at which tech is growing and also the diversity of ways that we have to interact with technology. And at the same time, the integrations between tech and the city are going faster and faster. And so So that's happening from the city side. But then from the human side, I mean, as humans, we're not really changing. You know, we don't have like sudden mutations. Our learning speed is pretty much the same for like centuries, right? And so I believe at some point we're gonna come to a threshold uh, where I think something has to give in. And I keep thinking about the science some centuries ago, and we could have a Renaissance man, and this person could kind of get a bit of everything and be a really good scientist. But eventually, like science became so complicated, more complicated than what a single man could handle. And then what happened was science started having specialists, and these specialists started working together, right? Because it was just too much for like a single person to know everything. I think the same will happen with technology in the city. It will be too complex, and something has to give in because we cannot learn everything at that speed. And so I think what has to give in is actually technology. And what we should focus to design the interface for the future city is actually on psychology. Because again, humans don't change. Our psychology doesn't change. So we should maybe focus on this. And so, yeah, I just wanted to, so from now, I wanted to introduce a few concepts that I've thought about before, and these are kind of in the form of guidelines, but it's basically good practices from UX, from digital UX, and how we could apply this to the city. Some examples are taken directly from digital to the city, and there's also like some considerations that we should have of like how the city is different from the web. So it's not a good idea to just take everything and map one-to-one and hope it will work. There are very obvious differences, but I'm also showing some examples that of things that are already happening, and hopefully we can keep doing this more and more. Yeah, so as with digital city now, I think a future city should be seamless to use. So I think the technology should never get in the way of people. And this is a bit defined by Mark Weiser as the ubiquitous computing paradigm a long time ago. We're still not there. I see a lot of screens, I see a lot of friction. But the example I talked a while ago, Amazon Go, I think it's a really good example because you don't even notice that you're paying. It just for good or bad. You're just leaving the store and everything happens in the background, and it's very easy to forget you're interacting with a digital system actually, because it's just so analog, right? And then also I feel like in the city or in the analog world in general, our brain is very smart and kind of knows what to filter and what to focus on. I mean, our brain is always optimizing, right, to not to get overloaded. And so, but then when we move to the web, the experiences are still very different. Each website is still very different. We're getting more consistent along the way, but you still kind of need to learn a little bit on where to find things on each website, etc. Right? And I kind of feel like this will also happen in the city if we don't take care. There will be like dozens of ways to input and output information. Then there will be so many different ways, right? And so we don't want to overload our cognitive capacity, right? So I would say like we should keep things simple and consistent interaction-wise. And also for finding our way in the city. I mean, not just wayfinding in itself, but finding our way through information in the city. I think having really good information architecture and hierarchy is very, very important. And prioritizing flow over complexity is fundamental. You know, this is just an extreme example, but this image here. But you know, if we're not careful, something like this might happen in a few, you know, in some years, right? And so I think like information overload is a concern to me. I think we should apply information contextually when it's needed, not just everywhere, not just like in your face all the time. So being obvious is obvious, but I think we're still not there. Using affordances properly, it's kind of fundamental. And as we introduce new technologies to the city, it gets confusing. And I'm sure many of us have touch screens that are not supposed to be touched, like they're not interactive, but we don't really know if they are. So, and you know, maybe now 10-20% of the screens we encounter are interactive. So now we're like in this limbo, and there's no standard to understand if they can be interacted with, you know. So I think having good affordances is pretty important. And in the same way, having a kind of this concept of value proposition, right? Having like a single understandable concept of what does this do and why should I use it? Not just like something new that is there for the sake of being there. And so like everything should create value, right? And you know, why not? They should be delightful as well and engaging. And I think not everything needs to have a useful purpose. I think happiness is a very, very good goal as well. And this as an example is kind of interesting because it's also environmentally friendly. As an environmental engineer, I really like this one because it basically people decide to take the stairs instead of the escalator. So if you can combine, you know, using gamification, combine fun and usefulness, that's like the sweet spot, I think. And just to talk about some special considerations that are not exactly like web or like what we call digital, because when people think about digital, and if we ask people to, you know, to draw a computer, you know, most of them would draw basically a screen, right? Because that's kind of our image of what a computer is. That's where we interact with computers. But I also think like we shouldn't just put screens everywhere and hope for the best. I'm already a bit like concerned about the excess of like metal and plastic and kind of other unnatural materials because our subconscious is subconscious knows it, right? And so, well, if you go to like Starbucks, you can see everything is like using wood and natural materials, and you know, urban designers know this, interior designers know this, but tech people who are gonna put technologies there don't necessarily know this, right? And besides this, having emissive screens, and there are usually like pixels and like things moving, it attracts a lot of the attention from our peripheral view. And so it's really hard to focus if there are things like moving around, attracting our attention, even if it's not in your face, just like on the side. So one recommendation I have is try to use more reflective screens like e-ink or electrochromic or thermochromic based screens. Pixels are totally possible to do with these technologies. And so we can still have pixels, but they're reflective pixels. And that works really well for outdoors, I think. Yeah, so also, of course, you know, privacy and trust is a huge thing in the web. But I think in the city it kind of explodes even more because you don't have to worry just about the digital part, but you have to worry about people around you. And on the web, you kind of, if you're surfing the web in your home and your phone, you kind of know who's around you or not. But in the city, it gets really confusing and complex. So, you know, you might have a situation where you're inputting something on a public device, or and that device could be smaller or bigger. So when designing like for size and also like perspective and distance, it's really important to take into consideration privacy and trust. Um, and so that we don't have this situation as in the picture that's just trying to hide the ATM code. Yeah, so the other thing I've been thinking about is that people are using their mobile phones a lot, and I feel like there's less and less need for signage that is really up there, because people don't look up so much. At the same time, I feel like the floor is being pretty unused as an interaction platform, and so I was thinking if the floor shouldn't be a bit more used for interaction, not just signage as I have an example here, but to actually have interaction as you would have on the screen, but you know, foot-based interaction, right? And again, considering the spatial environment is really important. So not just floors or walls, but like things like, you know, hail or rain. They need to be really resilient. And also when designing screens, as I said before, considering direct sunlight and all these environmental things. So the other thing that the city can be, kind of the augmented city could be a really good benefit for everyone, is that it can be adaptive. Right? So the current city is not super adaptive. There are not many examples, I believe, that the city adapts to the people. Usually people need to adapt to the city. So adding technology would allow, for example, you know, a pedestrian street sign could understand if there's like a older person crossing, and or maybe like someone slower crossing, and they could adapt the time while the green is on, for example. There's this concept of maybe I made it up, temporary ownership. So I kind of feel like public benches, for example, they're kind of owned by one person at a time. So again, they don't adapt to this person, but I think with technology, you know, as digital screens while they're being used by this person, they could adapt to the person, right? They could adapt. They could understand if I'm a man, if I'm big, if I'm small, the height at which they show information. If I'm a kid, for example, maybe showing information lower would be really interesting. If I'm a tall person, maybe having controls above. So it doesn't have to breach privacy. Everything can be processed locally. Nothing is sent to servers or anything. So I think this is totally doable, and it will make the city work for us rather than us working for the city. And the last one is to maximize familiarity. And I have an example here, which is the checkout process in e-commerce sites. So usually for digital e-commerce sites, we get like less than 40% conversion rate from cart to successful shopping. But if you think about the real world, like I go to a shop, I take a pair of sneakers, I just go to the cashier and I pay, right? I know I have money, they're gonna take my money. It's like 99% conversion rate. So why in digital, you know, why is it so difficult to reach that? And we're probably not using enough familiarity, and we're not taking enough information from like the real world on how to design these things, and we're probably asking too much information, and that is not necessary. And so I think using familiar behaviors and metaphors are really key to kind of design the future city. And this example is from China, and many of you are probably familiar with WeChat. So in China, everywhere, every single, like the smallest shop, you know, doesn't matter who, they have a payment with WeChat, and then people just take their phone and scan their QR code, and that's it. It's paid. It's super simple, and it's a really, really interesting way that technology is almost seamlessly integrated into people's lives. So that they would do millions of dollars business through WeChat. I think it's really amazing. So yeah, and in sorts of, not really conclusion, but I think it's kind of obvious that, of course, technology should always be used to improve people's lives. But as Kranzberg first law of technology says, technology is neither good or bad, nor is it neutral. So intrinsically, technology doesn't want to do good or bad, right? But every time we input something into the system, it's going to have an impact, right? Whether we want it or not. And it's up to us to like properly account for all these scenarios, right? And so I would say, like, if the entropy of adding digital to an analog system to the city outweighs what it solves, I think we shouldn't do it. I think we shouldn't just add digital to the city just for the sake of it. And I believe if there's like an equivalent that is analog and less distracting, that takes less cognitive load, I think it's probably better to use that. And yeah, so kind of, I guess this would be the conclusion. I do think that integration with technology should not be an afterthought. I think like research is really, really important. And from us in academia and us in IT, who have, you know, to some extent the power to kind of distribute these things to people, we should think a bit deeper before releasing technology into the world, before it's like everywhere. Because hardware is really hard to change. You cannot just update with, you know, a software update every 2 months, right? It's hardware, and like people get used to using it in a certain way, so it's very like tangible, and you cannot just change people's mental models of interacting with their city, with the space that they live in, you know, every 2 months, right? So it needs to be like even more thought of than software. And so I believe it's kind of also our responsibility from creative disciplines to look at things. And I think each discipline is looking at things from like a different angle. And I think we all have strong points to contribute to the design of this complex system, which is the city. You know, from storytelling in film to, of course, UX, but industrial design, even art. Everyone can contribute with their own perspective. So I think there's no right way to do it, and we should kind of try to keep being specialists in our creative field, but also try to cross and learn a little bit of what other people are doing. Because eventually, you know, at the end, we're just designing for humans, and yeah, humans don't really change. So we're all designing for the same. So yeah, thank you so much. This is my presentation.
Thank you. Obrigado, Diogo. Thank you. You can see the applause, the virtual applauses in the screen. So yeah, that is a great presentation.
Thank you.
Well, I'm certain that it rang bells on people's minds, and So if someone have some question they know, they can place the question on the chat or just open the mic or wave their hand into the camera. You touched the point now in the end, because actually what we are trying to do here, it's exactly this blend of perspectives to the subject. It's much more complex than just pure digital that can change from 2 to 2 months, right? When you deal with the city, it's kind of different, although it changes a lot also during the month, you know, it's always changing.
Yeah.
But I don't know if someone
one of the important things is it's not just difficult to change, but it's expensive, right? And someone has to pay for it. You know, when you're doing tangible, of course, you know, we can want to change it from the goodness of our hearts, but you know, usually there's city budgets or, you know, some tech limitation or something that you cannot just like this upgrade it, right?
Yeah, sure. I have here in the chat, I have already some reactions. Philippe is a Portuguese born, but he's living in France for a long time, I think. He works a lot with well, he can explain better, but he works a lot with digital and questioning the digital in terms of artistic presence. He's the guy from the Facebook image. I don't know if you want to make your question or share this thought about the philosopher. Go, Philippe. Thank you.
Hi. Oh, sorry, I was finishing my
your lunch. Yeah.
My lunch. Yeah, I didn't listen to the beginning of your talk. Sorry, Diogo, but I just had the last slides. But I'm really happy to listen to someone who's actually working in the tech industry and talking about entropy. I think that's something we tend now to observe since 1 year or two in Silicon Valley, having designers, programmers. Realizing that their impact on society and social interactions are quite huge right now, and so yeah, very pleased to hear someone conscious and about those issues. And well, as Pedro says, I guess part of your presentation was maybe exactly the same as mine, even if it was shorter, because I think that those urban issues, the fact of having your voice, having your message written on a wall, and from this perspective, the Mathieu presentation this morning was quite interesting, between this fight between those voices, different voices, the illegal ones, the legal ones, and yeah, it's an ongoing discussion, and I think it's probably one of the most interesting to my point of view, because it really makes our two realities that we face today, and most of the time we have research on street and public space expressions. We have research on digital and digital art and new media art languages and forms. And to me, we must look at this like a whole simple and unique world. And those it will be interesting, and I'm not planning to do a PhD, but it will be interesting to really look at those those issues,
Yeah.
to link more
Those connection points, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Philip. Thank you very much. We have also here Mari. I think she's from Finland. Mari, do you want to give a voice to your comments or questions?
Yes, sorry. Yeah, just it was very nice presentation. I just wanted to give my 5 cents into this. I'm not going to share my video because I look awful. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. It's
I'm
your
wearing
right.
clothes. I'm wearing clothes. That's enough. So anyway, just.
No problem. No problem. Don't worry about that.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm doing a PhD in about graffiti experience, and I'm cognitive scientist and a product designer myself. And just first of all, in my own research, I'm hopefully finishing my thesis this summer. But in my own research, I have been thinking about these affordances, and of course the presentation was kind of well, general guidelines for, and probably every UX designer knows them more or less. But thinking about these affordances, so I think that you always have to consider, especially when thinking about research in a specialized group like graffiti writers or street artists or whatever, that the affordances are subjective. Like different people have different affordances, so it's a complex issue to create a city that provides affordances for different people, because, for example, empty wall affords something else for somebody else than a graffiti writer. Graffiti writer sees a template for an art or graffiti, but somebody else sees something else there. And then the other point is that, okay, it's also the topic of some of the later discussion here, but the more wider thinking should be applied, not just human design, human-centered design, but this life-centered and even more complex system-level thinking in design. And that is also a topic that I have been discussing with my colleagues and other cognitive scientists who are researching thinking and these mental models and decision making and stuff like that. That it's more than a human. It's also other organisms, either living or non-living creatures and systems, and that also is a quite big trend in UX design, I think.
Yes, it's an yeah. It's I don't know if you want to comment, Diogo.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I do think affordances are very specific to each individual, but I think to some extent we probably need to create some consistency and kind of I wouldn't say rules, but if we're creating something new, and if I'm not really talking about walls, but I was talking more about like integration of tech in the city. If we're introducing something new, we should design it in the way, or we should create habits in people that this does this, you know, and so that next time people see something very similar, they would kind of understand intuitively how to interact with it, or what does it do, what's the value proposition that they're offering. Of course, a wall, you know, would be an empty wall. It's very similar everywhere. It's an empty wall, and people would look at it in very much the same way. Maybe the shape and the color will be different. But I guess with tech, depends on who makes this device, and we should have some at least standardization between tech companies who will and between, you know, urban design, etc., who will put this out there in the wild for people to use. There should be at least some standard of what things mean and how things can be interacted with. And by the way, I love Finland. My previous I used to work for Reaktor It's a Finnish company
Okay.
in Helsinki. So I spent the whole
I know
winter there. It's a lovely
Yeah.
country.
Thanks. Yeah, I just have to comment that of course, yeah, I also approach these things from user psychology and design, and that's really important part in my own PhD work. But I'm just thinking that what would be kind of the universal level of what people share, and of course those are the basic biological and psychological principles. But then there's the cultural aspect. And like I said, the culture is learning, and if there's a specialist like a street artist or graffiti writer, then his or her learning is different probably than from somebody else's, and that's also the tricky part. I'm not giving any answers, but just thinking out loud.
Great. Thank you, Mary.
Great.
I have
Mary.
also a comment or a question to be made by Shreya. I think, Shreya, are you there? Can you turn on the mic? I think Shreya, she made a question here in the chat. There are not questions, there are comments. Do you want to give voice to this? Oh wait. Okay, she went away. So okay, no problem. Ah no, she's here. Shreya, no. Well,
she's not at her desk, Pedro.
Okay. Yeah, I'm seeing. Yes, true. It's physically away. She's hearing the. Okay. Thank you, Peter. Okay. Some of these thoughts and comments from Mary make lots of sense with the experience of Jan, I think, because Jan, he works on, well, inside the car design and UX. So this, when I think of a car, I think of as an object that Shreya.
Hi, sorry,
No problem.
I walked out of my room for a minute.
Yeah. So we go back to your comment. Do you want to comment something?
Yeah, I mean, all these discussions about smart city and technology and creating a layer in the city, it has, and I know we probably agree on it, but it has a bias that's kind of excludes a huge chunk of the world, because I live in India and I live in Gurgaon. We have power cuts at least once a day. And so technology, while useful, and I don't think it's kind of like capitalism, right? Like you can't fight it and you can't say that we're going to stop, we don't want to use technology. It is the system that's there and it's developing the world in a certain way, but it's very unevenly distributed. So you have places in the world where it's so unreliable that in some ways the technologies that are developed in parts of the world that most of the speakers I'm hearing from is not that useful for many other parts of the world. And that seems to be an important thing. And it's kind of like in the way that graffiti is political and it is a resistance, in the same way you see people, especially here, like hacking and making do with technology and using it in ways that it's not supposed to be used. Which is really interesting, but I feel like it poses a challenge to these big companies and these bigger ideas of like, yes, we're gonna design around users, but the users are different everywhere, and the requirements of the users are extremely different here than probably in Finland and Sweden and in Europe. So that it was just something that struck me because I was watching it and I was like, yeah, it's like this amazing smart city idea, but like
I'm very happy that you are in India giving voice to so many people.
No, I'm not at all. And like, it's something that just struck me. There's enough
No, but
people.
it's true. It's true. You have a vision of a reality that we in other contexts do not have. But well, Diogo, I don't know if you want to comment something or
Yeah.
add something.
Yeah. So yes, so I agree with that to some extent. So one point I want to make is that my presentation is not about the present; it's about the future. And I would argue that technology will be in the city, maybe everywhere, even Gorgon. And I would say that maybe the timing at which that happens is different, right? You know, same as mobile phones. Mobile phones were in Europe and in the US first, and then eventually, you know, everyone in Gorgon has a mobile phone virtually, right? And specifically, what I'm doing almost every day at Google, half of my projects are for India, so I'm very much aware of how things are in India, and we're very much aware of we need to design things for, in this case, India, but for other emerging countries. And so research is really important. I mean, even in January, I was in Gorgon, I was in Lucknow, I was in Jaipur, and we were like talking with people, and we're trying to the best of our ability to understand their needs. And we work with, sorry, I'm talking a bit about Google, but it's just an example of how these technologies, I believe, should be developed, because we need to develop also with people who are local, and not just user research, but actually having teams locally, and having teams from like different countries with like different backgrounds, and who can represent users from where they come from. I think that's also really important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, it also brings to mind, you know, I think something that was mentioned earlier about how I think user experience in the digital space is maturing to a point where there is this cross-pollination between it and other disciplines like architecture and urban planning and things like that. And one of the things that I think about when I heard your comment, Shreya, was this concept in the digital space of progressive enhancement, right? So you're kind of designing first for the kind of you know, lowest common denominator, which really means like the base level experience. Like if the technology didn't enable a more enhanced user experience, starting there and then building progressively in layers the technology on top of that to enhance the experience. So in the case that the technology fails or simply is not there, you still have a base level experience that still works for everyone. And I think that, you know, thinking in that regard, progressive enhancement can almost be applied to any kind of thinking. And it originated in the digital space out of the need for like, you know, smartphones that didn't have certain features and capabilities, specifically in countries like India, where, you know, maybe the devices were a lot different from what you would see, for example, in the United States. So it's that kind of mentality of baking that into the initial process of creation and building an experience around this kind of progressive layers.
Well, thank you, John. I think we all got caught by you, so I think you can take it on. Do your presentation. I think it's your time. I don't know if everyone agrees with that. I think it's the best. We are on schedule, so please take on. Thank you, Diogo. Obrigado.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, it's working.
Excellent. So what I kind of prepared today is very much something that I've already kind of been talking about, but I'm kind of integrating in a few thoughts regarding how this could apply to the physical space, and really meaning for it to be a conversation starter in this forum. So you know, a little bit more about me, a multidisciplinary designer, speaker, writer, digital creator. I'm based in Detroit. I am currently working at an automotive company, working on digital experiences within the vehicle, specifically around you know, things like autonomous technology and electrification of the vehicle. But you know, I kind of have worked on a lot of other things not automotive related that have all kind of interconnected in some way or another. I have recently kind of had a book published with O'Reilly Media, and a lot of what I'm going to kind of go through today is touching on that book, but then drawing a correlation back to the physical space. So the book is called Laws of UX: Using Psychology to Design Better Products and Services. And really, the premise of this book is to provide a very soft introduction, almost like a guidebook for designers who have traditionally not always rooted their practice in psychology, which again, this cross-pollination of disciplines I think is absolutely critical, especially as user experience design has kind of matured. The project was a kind of a spin-off of a website I created called Laws of UX. So, you know, I encourage everyone to check that out if you haven't already. It's, you know, I think one of the things that I've always tried to emphasize on this site is that it's not just about digital experiences. It really is about, you know, kind of defining these psychological heuristics and principles that can really kind of help inform anybody's work, whether they're an urban planner or architect or a user experience designer. And this is kind of a quick rundown of the chapters. I'll talk about a few of these that I think are probably the most relevant, but you know, it really kind of spans the gamut of heuristics that are directly appropriated from psychology themselves, and then also kind of like a little bit of that ethical consideration factor, because I think that it's important to talk about the ethical implications of any work you're doing as a creative, as someone that's creating either products or physical spaces, and consider how that impacts everyone. You know, just to the point that Shri was making, sometimes that is, you know, people in countries like India, or, you know, that the technology might have not quite caught up to what we might experience in places like Europe and the United States. So I'll go through a few of these. I start the book off very purposely with Jacob's Law, which states that users spend most of their time on other sites. This means that users prefer your site, or, you know, you could also think of this as your physical environment or space to work the same as all the other sites or spaces that they already know. And I think really this has been mentioned many times already in this during this discussion, but mental models is very important. So in the book, I'm using these kind of psychological heuristics and principles to really kind of get at deeper psychological concepts like mental models, which I think are really important and really transcend that digital physical space, right? It can be applied to really anything, because it's about human psychology at the end of the day. And, you know, it's really interesting to see how the physical and digital space kind of informs each other, right? So like a lot of the form controls that we're all familiar with in the physical space, on the large image on the right, or I'm sorry, the left, you'll see that that's a screenshot taken from a control panel. That's actually the Apollo NASA control panel in contrast to digital form inputs on the web. And you can kind of see how that mental model of switches and toggles and buttons has made its way into the digital space. I'm also really interested to see how the digital begins to then go back and inform the physical space, right? And I think Yojo kind of touched on that a little bit. Sometimes there could be that kind of inspiration that goes two ways, not just always the physical space informing the digital space. And then on the top right, there's the seat controls. This actually, I believe, comes from a Mercedes vehicle, but very intelligently mapping in a physical environment the controls in the form of the actual seat, which I think is really interesting. It's kind of that, you know, user experience comes into the digital space, or I'm sorry, the physical space inside the vehicle, and it's mapping our mental model around the seat that we're already familiar with to the actual controls. You could easily imagine, and I'm sure we've all been in vehicles that would map these vehicle controls, these seat controls in a horizontal row. And by doing that, you absolutely lose all kind of ability to map the control to the actual seat itself. You have to kind of trial by error. And then below that is actually a screenshot from you know, an e-commerce website. I think this is a good example to mention as well, because really it talks about how typically when we go to e-commerce websites, we know exactly what we're looking for and where to find it. So for example, the shopping cart in the top right corner has become more or less a convention that we've looked for. I'd be really interested to hear how that has started to kind of play into the like the physical environment and architecture. You know, and a lot of times, in a lot of ways it has, you know, where doors, you know, more or less being on, you know, on the ground level, and these kind of standardizations of the physical environment that we're familiar with. But, you know, in the digital space, you can see, you know, there's some standardization happening, which is really convenient for people. This next example, also from the digital space, you know, I call this out because I think that really Google specifically has always done a really good job of kind of minimizing what's known in psychology as mental discordance, right? So when there's a big change to something that that a person's already familiar with, it can be kind of disjoining, right? It can create a lot of discordance. And I think that Google's always done a good job of this, whether it's with YouTube or with Google Calendar or a lot of their other products, where they really introduce this gradual kind of introduction to a new, to a redesign, and allow for people to kind of opt back into the older experience if they want to. And what it's doing effectively is easing them into something new. And again, making a correlation between digital and physical, I'd be interested to understand how that is even possible in the physical space. Could we introduce people in an urban environment in the city to something new without asking them to fully kind of commit to that? I'll go back. And you know, I want to kind of take away for each one of the heuristics that I kind of talk about here. In the physical space, this could mean following, you know, standardizations when appropriate, using plain language with things like wayfinding, and really making wayfinding information clear and obvious. That might mean moving it to, you know, digital, as Yojo pointed out. I think that our smartphones have become almost kind of like an extra appendage. You know, it's like a augmentation of our physical abilities. And I think that maybe that's kind of the natural evolution of where wayfinding finds itself, like with augmented reality and things like that. So, you know, something to consider. And in the book, I do draw a correlation between a lot of the design exercises that are pretty common in the user experience community that I think could also benefit, you know, other disciplines as well. For example, personas, which I'm sure everyone's probably familiar with to some degree. But I think personas are great, especially in the context of Jacob's Law, because they really provide a frame of reference and help define incredibly valuable information for the team, right? It helps designers get away from the self-referential thinking. I, as a user, would think this or would do this, and puts them more in the mindset of the people that are actually in the environment and have specific goals and objectives, which might actually not, you know, be the same as us as creators and designers and researchers. Another very important, you know, chapter in the book is dedicated to peak end rule, which is actually a cognitive bias, and it, kind of put forth by Daniel Kahneman, which states that people judge an experience largely based on how they felt at its peak and at its end, rather than the total sum or average of every moment of the experience. And I think this is really important because it starts to kind of draw this correlation between digital products, physical, you know, environments, and kind of like this narrative across a timeline of that experience and how that informs how people remember the digital product or environment. Daniel Kahneman kind of postulated this theory after you know, doing a series of studies. The one I'm illustrating here is called "When More Pain is Preferred to Less, Adding a Better End." I think this is really important for you know, anyone creating products or anything really, is this kind of understanding of how people remember an experience. What Daniel Kahneman did in his study was really kind of break groups into two groups. The first trial, they put their hand in water, pretty cold water, for about 1 minute. And then the second group repeated that you know, task of putting their hand in cold water for 1 minute, and then moved their hand to slightly warmer water for an additional 30 seconds. And what Daniel Kahneman actually and his associates found was that it was the second trial, the group that had their hand in the water the longest, actually remembered the experience more favorably, right? It created an impression on them of a more pleasurable experience. And I think that, you know, that's something that's also kind of interesting in regards to not only digital products and experiences, but also physical, is this kind of concept of where you kind of strategically identify emotional peaks, whether they're positive or negative, and then seek to kind of optimize them when they're, you know, positive peaks, and then, you know, fix them when they're negative. One interesting kind of like correlation to this would be, for example, if you've ever went into an Apple and, you know, the Apple store, and they really kind of turn the head on retail, because instead of, you know, finding your product and then taking it to a checkout counter and trying to track down sales associates to answer your questions, and who may or may not have any information on the product that you're looking at, Apple did something a lot different. They created a very aesthetically pleasing space that was open and really allowed for these, you know, sales associates, you know, people that worked in the store to kind of approach you, answer questions. They're kind of make themselves available throughout the store. And then you have this concept of the Genius Bar in the back, you know. And I think what that's really done is, if you were to compare, for example, buying a product in the Apple store versus buying a product in like a retail store like Best Buy or something like that, it is very much a different experience. In the digital space, I think that you see peak end rule kind of manifest itself in a lot of different ways. One of my favorite examples is things like MailChimp, where, you know, if you've ever had to create a newsletter, it can be a really stressful experience. You know, you're sending this off to a lot of people potentially, and you're, you know, really sweating the details. You want to make sure that there's no, you know, typos. You know, you want to make sure your information is correct. And MailChimp has really kind of identified that and capitalized on that moment. So you can see the hand hovering over the button. This is their mascot, Freddie, and he's really, you know, it's funny because he'll even start to kind of sweat a little bit and hover his finger over the button. And they're really, what MailChimp is doing here is they're recognizing this moment of potential peak you know, it could be a very stressful moment for people, and then they're introducing a little bit of humor to take the edge off. And then once you finally actually hit the send button in the top right corner, you can see Freddie gives you a high five. He's kind of celebrating with you. This is an emotional peak throughout this experience of creating a newsletter that the brand is celebrating with you at a moment they know through their own research that you're going to be celebrating, right? And then the bottom right example is actually from Uber. This is their Uber Express Pull app. And, you know, I think Uber is one of those organizations that's done a fantastic job of ensuring that UX research is critical to their process. And what they actually identified was that it was actually this waiting time between the moment you've ordered your ride and actually received it that they found that there was the most drop off from people, and that was the pain point for most customers of their service. And so what Uber did was really kind of seek to kind of improve that negative kind of downward peak to introducing more transparency operationally. So in the app, you see, you know, what's happening, where the driver is, who that driver is, you know, more information about them. You can learn more about, you know, that individual driver and Uber Express Pool in general, maybe even the other kind of occupants of the vehicle. And on top of that, they've introduced this kind of concept that you find a lot in the digital space of delight, right? So animations and this kind of storytelling kind of aspect that really improves the user experience through these kind of delightful micro interactions. Drawing a correlation between peak and roll in the physical space, I think that really in the physical space, this can mean identifying those emotional peaks like I mentioned, and really optimizing for them to elevate the user experience. So, you know, if it's, for example, the MailChimp example, when it's someone celebrating a newsletter send, you know, they sent that off, you know, the brand is celebrating with the user. In the physical space, that could mean, you know, you've reached a flight, the top of a flight of stairs, right? That could be a peak moment of celebration for people to capitalize on in a physical space. And that's just, you know, one example. I'm sure there are many, many more. One design exercise, yet again, that has proven to be incredibly valuable for UX designers, and I think could be valuable for, you know, those creating physical spaces, is this idea of journey mapping, which really kind of identifies through a linear kind of timeline the phases and this kind of emotional status of an individual throughout that kind of timeline. And what this does is give designers a very visual representation of where people are throughout the experience. So where those emotional peaks and valleys are, right? And then those are what you can hone in on and iterate on from a design perspective. Another heuristic that I think is quintessential and is included in the book is this concept known as, or principle heuristic known as Hicks' Law, which really states that the time it takes to make a decision increases with the number and complexity of choices available. I think Diogo did a great job of kind of touching on this a bit, right? It's all about kind of, you know, the kind of simplicity and of an experience, and really, you know, kind of capitalizing on that, you know, familiar experiences, and getting rid of any extraneous kind of information that might kind of veer people off in a direction that's unintended. A lot of the book is really about kind of bringing these psychological concepts and laws to the attention of UX designers. But I really think that there's correlations between any kind of discipline. And this idea of, you know, the mind being a finite resource of kind of cognitive capacity is a really important idea. So the idea of, like, the more options you have available, reaction time goes up, has a very deep impact on the experience of the occupant of a space or the user of a product, right? And then below there's this kind of concept of our working memory, which we kind of use to make decisions. And I think that if you think of it in terms of there's slots, much like a computer in memory, there's only so many slots that we can really kind of work with, because there's going to be occupied memory, right? There's going to be things that people carry into an experience with them that's already there. So in a physical space, this might mean they're trying to find a physical office. They carry that into the experience with them, and in not overloading people with choices helps them to retain that information without having to kind of go back in and remember, oh wait, what was it I was doing, right? I mean, we've all probably walked into a room with something on our mind that we needed to accomplish, and by the time we got there, forgot what that was. I think, you know, in the physical space, there's kind of a lot of examples. The one that I point out in the book is actually related to what's known as universal remotes, which we've probably all seen. And I point this out because this is kind of one of my most favorite things on the internet. You know, this kind of taping off of controls. These are actually grandkids kind of helping out their grandparents and taping off everything that's not relevant to what that, you know, the grandparents likely to do, right? So my favorite is PBS written down at the bottom of the remote on the right. It's just really kind of eliminating those choices in order to optimize for how efficient the person is using the device. I think you can make the same correlation to the physical space, right? The more information you have, you know, Times Square is a great example of this. And I've never been to Tokyo, but I would imagine it's very similar. There's information everywhere, and really kind of staying focused on a goal becomes a lot more of a challenge. In the digital space, UX designers have found a lot of ways to kind of get around this. One of my favorite examples is actually can be found with the digital product Slack, which really helps to kind of, they focus a lot on the onboarding experience, which really, instead of kind of dropping them in and saying, this is how this works, this is how this works, and kind of just letting them loose, Slack actually limits the functionality, and you have to kind of do an action to kind of, you know, have more access to the application. So the first thing you do when you get dropped into Slack is actually have to send a message to a bot. And in the process of doing this, it's you're kind of being progressively onboarded, right? You're being taught to use the application with no kind of, you know, no downfall, because you're communicating with a bot. And slowly through that action, you'll get access to more kind of portions of the application. So you've learned by doing, which I think is really important. I think there's a lot of correlations between Hicks' law and the physical space. One of them means that it can mean communication should be clear, and eliminating information that's that can cause unnecessary distraction is important, right? Like, again, people have a limited cognitive capacity in terms of working memory, and trying to achieve a goal when inundated with options becomes a significant challenge, and it ultimately affects the user experience. I think, you know, Diogo pointed this out, but it's also important to consider when information could provide delight where appropriate, right? Not everything needs to be minimized for the purpose of creating value. Sometimes it can be there to kind of provide these moments of delight, much like what we kind of looked at with peak end rule. And another effective design exercise that is frequent in the UX community is card sorting, which really kind of helps, you know, again, that user experience research that is happening with people that will use the product or be in the physical space, helping them kind of like project their own mental model on the information architecture, right? So this is how they would find the information they're looking for. And then this research informing how the product or space is actually designed. I mentioned earlier, but it really, in order to kind of talk about psychology when it comes to people in products or even spaces, I think it's important to kind of consider ethical responsibility, right? Because as creators, we have a lot of it. We have a lot of responsibility because we have a lot of power. And I think the UX community is really kind of grappling with this at the moment, because we finally got to the point where we're maturing enough to see the implications of what bad design can do. So, you know, I think that's important to kind of consider. I know we're kind of running out of time, so I'll speed up here. But, you know, a lot of this kind of comes from this, a lot of the behavioral kind of science that was done by B.F. Skinner in the 1950s and on, really talking about the operant conditioning chamber, also known as the Skinner box. And if you're familiar with this, he would place subjects like rats or pigeons in this box and really kind of test them on the stimulus response loop to see how he could shape their behavior. And I think in the digital space, we're kind of grappling with this because we've found that intentionally or unintentionally, a lot of the digital products we all use are shaping behavior, and that's not always being done in a good way. But you know, this kind of correlation between behavioral psychology and what we're doing, not only in the digital space but the physical space as well, is an important kind of concept to know about. In the digital space, there's a lot of examples of this. Pull down to refresh, if you're familiar with that pattern on Twitter, very much kind of mimics like a slot machine in a casino, and it also is rooted in behavioral psychology, because turns out human beings are actually more likely to kind of repeat a pattern when they get what's called a variable reward. So something different every time they do it. And this is actually kind of provided or basically created this context where people want to impulsively do a thing, even if it's not good for them. You'll see similar patterns on things like YouTube, where autoplay video is happening. And it's actually the digital product that's forcing people into a behavioral pattern that's not necessarily good for them all the time. And then additionally, on the bottom, of course, is the Facebook like. And I think this also speaks to that kind of what began as this moment of delight in the product turned into this kind of social affirmation mechanism that had a lot of negative impacts on social conversation and dialogue online. I think a lot of this was already mentioned, and I want to kind of repeat this. I think quantitative data tells us a lot that's useful, especially like what people are looking at and what they're doing. But what it doesn't tell us is why people are behaving a certain way and how that's impacting their lives. And just to kind of repeat, I think in the physical space and in the digital space, the implications of quantitative research is critical, right? So it's not just about what the data is telling you, it's about what people are telling you in terms of how it's affecting their lives. And if you go and you're with a day in the life with people and you see how they're actually interacting with something, whether it's a space or a digital product, I think that's quintessential in the work that any creative should be doing. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you. I will applaud and everything.
Thanks.
Great presentation. I thank you very, very much for this. I think it's a privilege to have you giving us this kind of content, because in a certain sense, usually this kind of content, it's only accessible for the big corporations to deal with us with their products and services. And having access to this kind of information for whatever possible other production events or research, continuation of research or other, to keep it free in some ways, it's very relevant, So in this sense, I thank you very much for this moment.
Thank you.
I hope that you agree with me. The audience agrees with me in this sense. And if someone have some specific question for Jan, can go ahead and use the time for that. I don't know if someone wants specifically or have some idea specifically. No one.
I would like to say that in the real world, you know, I think that one of the topics that would, I know, at least would interest me to see how it works is signage, because it's exactly something that, you know, you want people to see. And actually, if you look at talking specific about road signs and specific about, you know, fire signs, exit signs, things like that, which are actually heavily regulated. At least in Israel, you have even, you know, you have the font, the size, where it is going to be located, like and and one thing that I've noticed is when I drive in different countries, how the signage changed. Like the first time I was in Italy, and I found out that when you go in a roundabout, the sign to the exit is after. Your eye is supposed to be after the, you know, the exit that says you were supposed to take a right here. It drove us crazy. Or in the States, that you have the word stop. It doesn't have a hand or anything. You know, you need to learn the language to actually know what the sign says. You know, so just thinking about, you were saying about standardization, it was like, and I know that in the States they're like really some organizations are really into signs. There's like Dawn Jordan in Texas, she has this whole, they have a sign magazine, and if you're into standardization and design, I think you should look into them, because they're this really quirky group and they have really cool ideas.
Very cool.
Yeah, and another thing.
Do you mind sharing a link to that in the chat? I'd love to check that out.
I'll look it up. I'll send her name, and I'll look if they have a website. But they do have a magazine, and they have like annual meetings and everything, all on signs.
Yeah.
And they're really nice people.
Yeah.
And the other thing I wrote in the chat is that you were saying that you would like to know how in urban design you have things, you know, to make people into changes. And I wrote that a lot of people are using tactical urbanism exactly for that. Like right now in Tel Aviv, they put all the bike lanes exactly like that, because, you know, they're afraid that if they do it permanently, people will be angry. So they just, you know, they start doing it small, and then it's okay. So they do the next level. And you have neighborhoods that are doing that, you know, to slow down traffic, because it takes a lot of time to change the road. So you just put a nice, I don't know, you paint the road and you put a nice thing, and then it's okay. So you take it to your city administrative and say, look, nobody died, so let's do that. So like tactical urbanism is exactly a way to do this. Make small changes and maybe take it back if it doesn't work.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So it's really about kind of easing people into change in the environment slowly.
Well, originally was to do tactical urbanism, but yes, today it's used by many people. It's used exactly like that.
See, very interesting.
Yes, that's an interesting view on it. It fits one of the, you know, rules of UX design, and this kind of tactics that, for instance, Slack is using for, you know, letting the user to be adaptable to the next situation, and if possible can roll back. I don't know if there's more someone that wants to give voice to some question or comment that Jan can reply to. I'm seeing here also the next speaker. I think everyone, it's okay. It was quite interesting. Jacob, you want to?
I had more of
it's a comment.
Reflection for both of the speakers. Let me see there. I'm using 2 accounts at the moment because I'm moving around. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. So it was more of what I would say is a detail, but it was mentioned by both you and Diogo. This spatiality of digital of digitalness and of internet, and it the way of conceptualizing it, or making mental models, which I think I have had, and this is more of curiosity. Since I'm an art historian, I'm interested in historicizing. I use sometimes when I talk with my students who are born in the early 90s, I use a program from the Swedish radio where they talk about how to get into the internet. It's from 1993, I think. And what struck me when I heard that together with the students, they talk about getting into the internet. The speciality is it's a room they're going into. Mm-hmm. When I started using internet, we talked about getting out on the internet. Yeah. We conceptualized it as a kind of digital highway, the information highway. You were going out. But I'm just realizing for the students today, I don't know if you're born in the early 90s, if you actually see the digital technology and internet as something, as a speciality, because I think it's all over. It's totally integrated in so many ways. Yeah. Do you know if somebody has tried to, especially in relation to public realms, I think that's very interesting, how you actually conceptually, are you outside, are you inside? Perhaps you are the two right persons to ask this question. Do you understand what I mean? I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think Yogo kind of pointed this out, but Mark Weiser and his kind of ubiquitous computing that he had kind of stated back in the early 90s. I think, it's just kind of like that's the world we're living in now, where it's everywhere. So it's hard to discern if you're in or on the information highway, right? I'd be curious to know that as well. But I think that what's interesting to me is seeing that technology is so ubiquitous in everyone's lives that there's starting to become a backlash where people are looking for moments in their lives and days of the times in their days where they can be away from technology. So we're almost trying to kind of pull back a little bit, and it's interesting to see how that's kind of, the pendulum is swung the other way, so to speak.
I have a comment from Mathieu Tamberla. He's in France.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Jacob, which was speaking about the relationship with user experience and space, about these books that we have in French. Unfortunately, I don't know if it's translated. It's called Circumnavigation, and it's a thesis of a researcher who is a sociologist and work on the experience on the internet and how it draws a parallel on the way people behave when they go on the internet, what their experience of navigation, and he make comparison with the avant-garde of the walk as a shape for practice, So it's really this parallel that is drawn based on user experience between the online and IRL experience. It's just like, I think it could kind of make the connection between the experience we were speaking about those.
Could you?
I'm gonna wrote a link to the book.
Yeah, please, thanks.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Matthew. So I will pass on to the next panel. Thank you so much, Jan. Diogo, I don't know if someone else have last question. If not, I will pass on. Okay, I will pass on because